Happy First Amendment Friday, my favorite day of the week, and it's a pleasure to be with you. We try to deliver some honestly provocative talk radio for America, and you're invited to the conversation every day of the week. But on First Amendment Friday, we take off all the wraps. We make sure that every subject is fair game. At 866-HEY-LARS. And if you're a naysayer, you go right to the head of the line at 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@larslarson.com and consider our Twitter poll. You can find it two different places. I'll give you the actual poll question. But every day of the week, we put up a brand new question trying to reflect the news of the day. So it's a brand new question every single day. But I've got a question for you just to start off a First Amendment Friday. Are Americans ever going to get tired of listening to and accepting the lies of politicians? And there's one that's been on my mind since last night. Last night, I ended up talking to John Solomon. He's the guy who founded JustTheNews.com. He's a great investigative reporter. He digs up stories that very few other news organizations have. And I don't mean that to say that Just the News reads like some kind of tabloid site or maybe the Wide World News or National Enquirer. No, he comes up with the good substantial stuff. And let me tell you where there's a substantial lie that should be called out. It was made on behalf of Joe Biden. Joe Biden actually made it himself. Let me remind you that about 3 years ago, it's not exactly 3 years ago, it was the fall of 2020. And the presidential debates were going on between President Donald Trump, and Joe Biden. And President Trump correctly called out Joe Biden. Now, President Trump has been called a liar on so many occasions. As you know, I'm a Trump partisan. I'm going to be voting for him in the primaries. I'm going to vote for him in the general election next year. But he has called out so many people, and he has told us so many things that are going on. And the routine reaction of the mainstream media and other politicians is to say Trump is lying, except that you understand in most of those cases, we find out later Trump was telling us exactly what was going on. It would have been smarter to believe him. So Donald Trump on that debate stage called out Joe Biden and said the Biden crime family was taking money from communist China. Now, that would be quite an indictment, because think about it this way. If you got an American president, any American president of any political party who is compromised to a foreign government, any foreign government, that is a problem. Okay? Whether you're compromised to Cuba or Venezuela or the Middle East countries, that's a problem. But if you're compromised to communist China, a country that plans to replace the United States as the preeminent country on planet Earth in military, in diplomacy, in economic success, China plans to replace us. And I have been making the case for a long time that the Biden crime family, for what amounts to a pittance, I mean, it's a substantial amount of money for any of us, millions of dollars the Biden crime family has taken in from Ukraine, from Romania, from Moscow in Russia, and also from Beijing, from communist China. And Donald Trump laid down the indictment on Joe Biden on that debate stage and said, your family is taking money from communist China. And in fact, Joe Biden explicitly denied that. He said, my family is not taking any money from communist China. Do we have that soundbite handy? Donovan's a great producer, is my executive producer of the program. Donovan, let's play that soundbite just so people know I'm not exaggerating what Joe Biden said. There are times where I'll play a soundbite and I'll say, now listen to what he said and how he said it. This is how I interpret it. You don't have to interpret this one. It is short. It is sweet. It is to the point. It is an explicit denial. Listen to this.
My son has not made money in terms of this thing about, what are you talking about, China.
My son has not made... Now, I understand Joe Biden sounds like he is mentally deranged or dim or something. But he said, my son has not made money about what are you talking about? China? Yeah, or China, as Donald Trump says it. Nobody says it like Donald Trump says it. And then what happened this week? 2 days ago, Hunter Biden thought he was walking into that courtroom in Delaware in front of a federal judge, and that he was going to get this sweetheart deal, take a plea, get a slap on the wrist, do a little bit of probation time, and pay a few dollars in fines, which I'm sure friends of Joe would be happy to pay those monies. They've already loaned Hunter Biden literally millions of dollars to pay off his back taxes. But What did he admit? Because what John Solomon pointed out, and I have to give John full credit for this. I don't like it when people plagiarize or steal other people's stuff. That's why you'll hear me credit other news organizations and other people all the time. I'm not like Joe. I don't steal speeches. I don't steal what other people have written. Joe Biden does all day long, and he has his entire career. Well, what happened is John Solomon said there's something that most of the media didn't take note of. There's a thing you do, and I've watched it happen myself sitting in a courtroom. Never had to do it myself. I've never been accused of a crime. I've never had to plead guilty to a crime like members of the Biden crime family. But Hunter Biden was doing what's called an allocution. And that's where when you take a plea deal, it's not just you walk into court and the judge says, you're accused of this. Are you guilty? And you say yes. You actually have to stand up and allocute. You have to say what it is you did. Well, Hunter Biden stood up in that courtroom 2 days ago, and he said he took $660,000 from communist China. Now, I don't think that's all of the money that the Biden crime family got from China. I think they got millions of dollars, maybe even tens of millions of dollars that they got from communist China. But he stood up and he allocated. So here he is standing in a courtroom in front of a federal judge under oath on the record, admits he took $250,000 from communist China. Now, are any of the reporters out there going to actually act like journalists and start to demand of the White House? I know Karine Jean-Pierre, she's got her hands full trying to say, well, you know, that's not really anything related to the president. That's personal family business. She's trying to declare that everything that happens to Hunter Biden that does tie back to dear old dad, the big guy, that somehow, oh, it's personal stuff. You know, all those papers stored in the garage, that's personal stuff. And Hunter's crimes, which benefited the whole family, that's personal stuff. We all know that a lot of that money went right back to Joe, and we know because of the laptop from hell, in which Hunter Biden himself complained, moaned, and griped about the fact that he had to pay all of the family's bills. So Joe Biden, on a debate stage in front of television cameras during the presidential debates, says explicitly, my son did not take any money from communist China. Except we've known for a good long time now that he was taking money from CEFC. That's the big China energy company. And if you're wondering, well, why should I care about this? Reason number one, because you have an American president who is compromised. He took money from foreign governments, and the foreign governments know that, and they can out him anytime they like. Problem number two, America's energy policy, which is key to our economic success. Joe Biden is trying to kill coal, kill oil, kill natural gas, and he says our energy future belongs to communist China through windmills and batteries and solar panels. It's First Amendment Friday. Your calls are welcome at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@larslarson.com and tell Alexa to play The Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to First Amendment Friday, 866-HEY-LARS if you want to connect. And naysayers always go first at 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@larslarson.com. Coming up this hour, why is there a mandatory retirement age for pilots, but not for the people who make the biggest decisions for our country? I've got a couple of sound bites, and I've been bipartisan on this. We'll play a sound bite from a Democrat and a sound bite from a Republican. You're going to enjoy it. It's coming up a little bit later. Did you know the USDA has now partnered with a massive Chinese biotech firm that was blacklisted by the Department of Defense? I know, it doesn't make any sense to me either. Should minors have access to so-called gender reassignment therapy and surgeries? You know my answer to that, but we'll talk about the details later. And I want you to take a moment to cast a vote in my Twitter poll. You'll find it two places, makes it more convenient for you. At Lars Larson Show on Twitter or larslarson.com on our website. Should taxpayers pay for special schools for queer students? I would say no to that. And if you're questioning my use of the Q word, let me tell you why. This is happening in Arizona. They have now launched what they call the Queer Blended Learning Center, a micro school that was launched or is being launched in the month of August for middle school students. And if you wonder, hold on a second. There are students who've already decided that they're gay when they're in middle school. So middle school, typically 6, 7, 8. means that they are 11, 12, and 13 years of age or so. The school, we're told, will be funded by Arizona education vouchers and housed at the downtown Phoenix headquarters of 1 in 10. That's the name of it, 1 in 10, a nonprofit that serves LGBTQ plus youth. The school's founders aim to give young people who may feel uncomfortable in a larger school a space to be themselves and learn, a safe space. Isn't that sweet? LGBTQ plus history will be on the curriculum. So I guess separate but equal does work when it comes to the LGBTQ plus crowd. Does that make sense to any of you? Should taxpayers pay for special schools that are only for queer students? I guess I'm taking it that they mean by that title. It's not my name. The Queer Blended Learning Center is somehow going to be only for those who identify as homosexual at middle school age, 11, 12, or 13 years of age. Again, crazy stuff out there. A shout out to our friends, including Chris Montgomery at our great affiliate station in Susanville. That's KSUE AM 1240, where you can listen to Great Talk Radio, Chris in the morning, Great Talk Radio, and other things all day long, and my show Monday through Friday. Glad to have you with me. I got a couple of other questions to pose for you. I mean, I know I'm full of them, but should there be a mandatory jail sentence for false reporting to the police? And my short answer to that is yes. I mean, over the years, I've run into so many occasions where something happened, whether it's a false bomb threat, a false threat of some other kind, false threats like so-called swatting, where somebody makes the police believe that a potentially fatal event has happened at somebody's home, trying to get the police to stage a SWAT raid on that home. I mean, these are dangerous, and they're absolutely wasteful of taxpayer and police resources. There is a story, and this just broke a few hours ago. Carly Russell, you may have heard the name, an Alabama nursing student. She disappeared for a time, and she claimed that she was kidnapped for just over 2 days, 49 hours. She now admits, she has confessed that that stunt was a lie. She has been charged with 2 misdemeanors in connection with the hoax. If this reminds you of Jussie Smollett, you're like me, because you say, if you file a false police report anywhere in America, there are laws that make that a crime. It may be a minor crime, in this case a misdemeanor. The arrest warrant for Carly Russell was issued earlier today. She has surrendered to authorities, accompanied by her attorney. She faces the 2 misdemeanor charges, but misdemeanors can still mean time in jail. False reporting to law enforcement and falsely reporting an incident. The charges carry a bond of $1,000 each. They're punishable by up to a year in jail and a $6,000 fine if convicted. You know, I've always thought that law enforcement agencies severely underused the false reporting statute. And here's what I mean by that. A kid decides to pull the fire alarm at a school. That is a false report. I would take it as a false report. You call the police and you pull what some people excuse as a prank. And you call the police and tell them something's happening, and it really isn't happening. And I've heard the case made before by both firefighters and cops that when you do that, when you call the police or call the fire department and you file a false report, the end result of that can be a firefighter getting killed on the way to a fire response. It can be a civilian killed because occasionally fire vehicles do end up hitting somebody as they're doing a lights and siren approach to that. It can also lead to swatting. It can lead to tremendous damage. In this case, none of those things happen. But this young lady, for whatever personal reasons, decided to disappear. That's okay. If you're an adult and she's an adult, you can disappear if you want to. You don't have to tell your family and friends where you are. And the police will tell you that. If you call the police and say, hey, there's this adult, they didn't show up where they were expected, we wonder where they are, the police say, well, we'll keep an eye out for them, but it is legal for you to disappear. What you can't do is create a situation in which it appears that you have been abducted. And in her case, she actually lied about what had happened, and that should be punished. And in fact, they should use those laws more often. And they should very much publicize when they prosecute somebody for that. To your calls on this First Amendment Friday at 866 Hey Lars. And if you're a naysayer, right to the head of the line at 866-439-5277. Eric, you're a naysayer, our first naysayer on a First Amendment Friday. What's on your mind, and where do you and I disagree today?
So, Lars, listener, first-time caller.
Thank you.
Because of, I'm calling about the vouchers for the ATQ school in Arizona, and based on precedence, I think that it should be allowed and should be paid for by taxpayer dollars.
Okay, based on what precedent? Separate but equal? Because I find the whole idea that you set up a school based on somebody's, I know they don't like the term sexual preference, whatever you want to call it. You're setting up a school specifically for one particular sexual minority. What is the purpose of it? How does it benefit the student, and how does it benefit the community to have a school? Most charter schools and most schools that a child might go to on a voucher are open to all, and they're open to all by law. You know, you don't have a school that's just for black or just for white. There may be male, female, and there may be a different model there, but how does it benefit the student and how does it benefit the community to have the queer blended learning center that's aimed specifically at a sexual minority?
I would say precedence. We do that for religious institutions all the time.
Well, hold on. Precedence, no, you keep using that term. If you want to establish a school and call it a Catholic school or a Jewish school or a Muslim school, you can, and then people can say, well, I choose to go to that school or I don't. But there's no prohibition that says, but if you're not Jewish, you may not want to go to this Jewish school. You may not want to go to a Catholic school or a Christian school. But that's about faith, not about sexual minority. How does it benefit the student to have a school that is only made up of homosexuals?
I would say, firstly, faith. There are many faith institutions that don't allow people that don't agree with them to attend.
Hold on a second, Eric. I'm not aware of a single Christian church that says you have to be a Christian to attend. Now, they will encourage you to become a Christian. I would encourage, if I met somebody, I'm a Christian, I'm a Protestant Christian. If I met somebody and they say, well, I don't have any religious faith, and I say, it's the most wonderful thing that can happen to you to have faith in God and believe in Jesus Christ. I would tell them that, but I'm not going to force them to do it. So when you say, what religious institution are you aware of that says if you're not a Christian, you can't come into our church?
Well, I'm aware of Mormon faith institutions that say if you don't believe as we do, one, you get excommunicated if you speak out about your beliefs, and two, there's a lot of these smaller.
Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. Stick around because I've got those sound bites from a Democrat and a Republican. We're going to be bipartisan today. But I've actually suggested that I think members of Congress probably should know when to hang it up. Apparently, Dianne Feinstein and Mitch McConnell do not. I'll give you those examples in a moment. First, let's go to Don in Alabama on a First Amendment Friday. Hey, Don, welcome to the program. What's on your mind today?
Hey, Lars. This is John, by the way, not Don.
Oh, John. Okay. Well, we'll be punishing producers all day long now. But go ahead.
I've been called worse. I was going to call in about the Carly Russell case. I'm from down here in Alabama, and of course, it's been getting a lot of coverage here. But I agree with you 100%. There needs to be jail time for that sort of thing. But one addition to that story you may or may not have mentioned is she claimed that she was trying to help a toddler on the side of the road when she was abducted.
I did mention that yesterday, but she was trying to make herself out to be a hero, right?
Yes, exactly. And this has been going on. I think this whole thing happened early last week. And so, now it's coming to fruition, everything, and her, admitting to it. But I just wanted to make that point about the toddler, but I agree with you 100% on, there needs to be jail time for that sort of thing.
Well, John, this has bugged me for a long time because as a reporter, like 40 years ago, I would ask the police, they would be dealing with a case, and they were all a little bit different. They weren't like this one. But I'd say, why don't you charge, even if it's a kid who pulls a fire alarm, and you get a lights and siren response from the fire department. And I had firefighters who were buddies of mine who said, we could end up on, if we're going lights and siren to a call, every once in a while somebody gets T-boned by a fire truck, or a pedestrian gets hit, or a firefighter, has an incident, falls off the truck, or has some other kind of incident because we're going lights and siren because we think, a school's on fire. And I always thought, if you actually punished people for that, and it depend on the case. I would hope a judge would go case by case and say, okay, you got a 15-year-old kid. He decided he wanted the rest of the afternoon off, so he pulled the fire alarm at school. Ha ha, very funny. Except it has real consequences. If that kid had to stand in front of a judge and get read the riot act by the judge, and then maybe had to do probation or a little bit of community service or something like that. I'm not necessarily saying send everybody to jail. I think this young lady should go to jail. She's an adult. She knows better, a nursing student, and very responsible profession she was pursuing. I think she should go to jail. And for a lot of law-abiding people, I've never been in jail other than to interview people. I've been in plenty of jails and prisons to interview people, but I've never been in there, because of something I've done. But I would be willing to bet that if somebody pulled this kind of stunt and said, we're going to file a false police report, to achieve whatever it is they're trying to achieve, that one night in jail or a weekend in jail would probably be the biggest wake-up call of their lives. Because having been in there as a reporter, there is no way in the world I'd ever want to spend time in a jail because I got sent there for something I did. And if you then publicize the fact this guy went to jail for filing a false report, it might actually wise up a few other people, wouldn't it?
Well, and yes, and you have to, on top of the possibility of an accident, there's cost involved in all of that too. Having all those services respond, there's money involved in that. She also, and I don't know if you mentioned this, but she also, apparently her motivation was to make her boyfriend jealous, by the way. So that was reported in the very beginning that was her motivation for doing this, was to make her boyfriend jealous, for whatever reason. We have no idea why she had that inkling, but anyway, the cost of the services for the cops and the firemen to come respond to something like that is also something that, is a big thing. And I know in past cases I have heard where they have made them pay for those services. They come up with an amount and they're fined that much, to pay back the cops and the firemen for, the services that they render doing that. So anyway, I just thought I would chime in on it, Lars. I love it.
It's a good point because, John, I'll tell you two things. One's a crazy idea I've thrown out for a long time. It's never actually got traction anywhere. But I'll tell you first, I can remember a case that I covered as a reporter. And there was this guy who worked at a gas station. And right next door was a convenience store, one of the Southland stores, 7-Eleven. And there was a shoplift incident, and there was a huge crowd over there. And the guy at the gas station, he was sick and tired of the crowd. And it was a younger guy, and he called the police and said, hey, there's something going on at the 7-Eleven, and I see a guy with a gun. Now, later on, this idiot told the police, well, I said that there was no gun, but I said it because I wanted to come to the incident faster. Well, in the end, that incident ended up with a guy dead. And he was a Marine veteran who was a law-abiding citizen. He ended up dead at the end of the incident, in part, I think, because of that false report. So people should know that the false report is not without consequences, sometimes involving life or death. Now, John, I've thrown out this idea forever. Like most of my ideas, they never go anywhere. I wish towns would come back with the stocks. You know what the stocks were?
No, sir, not.
They'd have a couple of posts, and they'd have one board with a half circle cutout in it. And a couple of other cutouts for your hands. You had to go up and put your neck through there, and they put the other board down on top. And they put them in the town square. So when some knucklehead did something abundantly stupid, they'd say, we're going to sentence you to, all day long Saturday in the stocks. And I'd put a sign in front of it. So it's not It's not physically damaging. It's not life-threatening. It is just freaking humiliating. And if they said, you are sentenced to 6 hours in the town square in the stocks with a sign in front that says, I filed a false police report, and this is, and I got 6 hours in the stocks, and put that right under the person. And maybe even these days put a webcam on it, so you could look on the webcam and say, who's in the stocks today? I think it's a great punishment for drunk driving, non-fatal drunk driving and things like that. If somebody ended up in the stocks in your town square in Alabama and people drove by and said, what'd that guy or what'd that gal do? Oh, filed a false police report, caused a lot of trouble, and they got in the stocks, wouldn't you think everybody would drive away or walk away from that saying, I'm never doing anything like that? Whether you're a kid or an adult, I think it would actually do some good, and it wouldn't cost much.
Absolutely. I kind of the scarlet letter type thing, let them wear it, let them, like you said, let them experience that. And I'm like you, I guarantee you that would knock off a lot of that garbage if that happened. So
it would. And think the cost would be this. If the judge said, okay, Saturday morning, you're showing up in the town square, you're going to be in the stocks for 6 hours. There'll be an officer there to lock you in, and then there'll be an officer there to let you out. We'll make sure you have plenty of water. And in the meantime, everybody in town is going to see what a knucklehead you are. It would be so cheap to administer, and I think it would be very effective. It's just my crazy idea, but nobody seems to like it. Let's go to Robert. Hey, Robert, welcome to First Amendment Friday. What's on your mind?
Well, the lady, I don't know if y'all know or not, but I think it's her boyfriend or somebody. I just heard it on the radio here between one of your breaks, that her boyfriend or whoever was with her, he's been charged with 2 misdemeanors also. And
because he participated.
And he just, when he was a police officer and he had them false reports, it's not right. It should be that more time. More time. She needs to spend more time than what they're going to give her, or whatever, if she even gets it.
Well, I hope her boyfriend gets it too. If he took part in that scam, that hoax, he ought to get punished as well. Robert, thanks for the call. I want to get these sound bites in. First of all, Mitch McConnell, we're going to have to do it a little bit later. We'll get it before the end of the hour. It's First Amendment Friday, 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@larslarson.com, and you're listening to First Amendment Friday. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show on First Amendment Friday. I'll get back to your phone calls and emails in a moment, but imagine this. You're a young lady, a girl. You're in your teenage years, and both adults and those in the medical profession, if you can still call it a profession these days, talk you into so-called therapy, which includes puberty blockers and even surgery. That happened to a young lady by the name of Chloe Cole, who testified before the House Judiciary Subcommittee on the Constitution and Limited Government. She says her childhood was ruined because she was talked into so-called gender-affirming care, which is a warm and fuzzy name for what I call medical mutilation of children. And I thought we'd talk about that with Terry Schilling, who's president of the American Principles Project. Terry, welcome back to the program.
Thanks so much for having me, Lars. I love coming on talking with you.
Well, tell me this. Do you believe that this hearing and the fact that members of Congress actually heard about what's being done to children in this country is going to change the course we seem to be on, where all the politically correct, the progressives, are saying we have to do gender-affirming care? They won't even call it what it actually is. They put a euphemism on it so that people say, oh, gender-affirming care, that sounds good. They don't say we're chemically castrating teenage boys and we're taking the breasts off teenage girls and changing them for life. They call it something else. They're not even willing to admit out loud what it actually is, and it's abundantly ugly, and I would call it criminal.
You're bringing up such a great point. The first thing I want to say, Lars, is that the detransitioners offer our best shot at turning this whole industry around. This is an industry. This is a financial industry. It's a $2.1 billion industry. That's as of 2022, that's last year's data. It's grown immensely since then. So the detransitioners are the key. The real thing that's going to turn this around is whether or not the Republican Party takes advantage of this and uses it in the political arena. We need to make sure that the American people know what is happening and just how horrific it is. Right now, the mainstream media is carrying water for this $2.2 billion industry that is wreaking havoc across our entire country. And the only way to put a check on that is to make sure that the American voters, the people that actually run this country and determine who represents us, that they vote the right way and that they stop rewarding Democrats and putting them in power. We have to turn this around. If we don't turn this around in the next few years, America is going to have a sterilized and genderless generation, and that is going to lead to our entire downfall.
Terry, I got to ask you this because I am a conservative first and a Republican second, but I'm ashamed of the Republican Party these days. I think these men and women lack the guts to actually call it out that way, because to me, it would seem like a great campaign issue. I mean, I understand that there are some people who criticize you for it, but if somebody running for re-election, and members of the House are always running for re-election, came out and said, I am not for the chemical or surgical mutilation of children, and my opponent is, that would seem to be one that would resonate with just about everybody, except for the tiny minority of people who think that mutilating these kids is a great idea. And I, as I said, I think the very fact that they use euphemisms instead of using real, words to describe what they're doing to these kids indicates they know it's wrong. They know it's so ugly you can't say it out loud. So call them out on it. Why are Republican members of Congress and other elected officials unwilling to do that?
They're unwilling to do it, or I wouldn't say they're unwilling to do it, because we have 21 states now that have banned these surgeries for minors, right? So they're starting to do it, but it's a human thing, Lars. I mean, look, it's uncomfortable for me. I've been talking about this issue since 2015. It's uncomfortable for me. It's sex changes for minors, right? It's not the most fun thing to talk about.
Nope.
It's a human tendency to not want to talk about difficult things. But here's the beauty of this. You don't have to choose between doing the right thing and the politically popular thing. This is one of the real areas that gives me hope for this great nation. And I'll tell you what gives me the most hope. 60% of Democrats in the latest Pew survey say that you should have to wait until you're 18 before you can get a sex change procedure or sex change hormones or these chemical castration drugs that we gave the friggin' sex offenders all throughout the night, all the way up until the 90s, until we declared that was too cruel for sex offenders, Lars. So 60% of Democrats support the Republican position on this, and only 15% oppose it, right? And so you still have 15% that's like, oh, I don't know, I'm too afraid to give my position on the phone. This is an awesome opportunity for Republicans to really show America just how out of touch and destructive the Democratic Party is.
See, I agree with you that we all do, we all do avoid, to some extent, one extent or another, talking about difficult things. And we also use euphemisms. I mean, if a young lady says, I need to go powder my nose, she doesn't say, I'm going to the toilet to urinate or defecate. I mean, you don't do that because it's just not. But this is really ugly stuff. I would think that defending kids from mutilation by doctors, and the fact that the medical profession has embraced this because there's a big pile of dollars. As you said, it's $2.2 billion now. It's forecast to be $5 billion within just a couple of years. So is it really the case that the medical profession, all the dancing doctors and dancing nurses from the pandemic, are now saying, yeah, but if there's money attached to it, we don't care how ugly it is? I would hope that people within that profession would say, first do no harm means don't chemically castrate little boys and surgically mutilate little girls.
So what I love about your show, Lars, is I don't have to stick to the approved talking points.
Thank
I
you.
actually was able to meet with one of these doctors. Endocrinologists deal with the hormones aspect of our bodies. His name's Quentin Van Meter. And I asked him this specific question: why are they doing it? Is it the money? Is it the financial gain aspect, or what? He actually rejected that. He said it's some of it. He said that it's the human ambition. It is the drive is actually a drive for technology. Just like human beings wanted to be the first ones to the moon, these corrupt doctors are so narcissistic. They're so self-ambitious that they want to be the first person to help people fully transform into the other sex. This is a war against God's design for humanity.
It
It's
is.
a war against nature. It's a war against our kids, and they're using our kids as guinea pigs. They're using even adults, I would say confused and, mentally ill adults as guinea pigs for this experiment. So they're all just mutilating them, and they're trying to perfect it. And their hope is not just a financial gain. They're making tons of money from it, yes, but their real hope is to be the first to successfully transfer another genital to another human being and really change the sex of a human being.
And by the way, the doctor whose video they played at that hearing, he's from my neck of the woods. I don't know this freak, but this freak is out there saying, we're still figuring it out as we go along. That's great. You're mutilating kids and you're figuring out whether or not it works. Says Terry Schilling from the American Principles Project. Terry, thanks very much. It's First Amendment Friday, and you've got the Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show, and welcome to my favorite day of the week, First Amendment Friday. Now, it only took 4 years for it to happen, but the President of the United States has finally admitted that he has a 7th grandchild. Now, why is that significant? I'll explain why in a moment, but Joe Biden waited till the middle of summer when most people aren't paying as much attention to the news. And he waited till, he did it the way politicians do with any piece of news that they really don't want to gather a lot of public attention. Wait till late on a Friday night and do what's called a Friday night document dump. Now, the way that works is if you're a politician or you say are in business and you act politically, the way to do it is flush that news out late on a Friday night in the middle of summer when most people are headed for a cold beverage or maybe the beach or the mountains or the river, and then push the news out then. And you can say, we have officially acknowledged it. Except in this case, Joe Biden has finally admitted the existence of his 4-year-old granddaughter, Navy Joan Roberts. And if you're asking, Lars, where did he get that 7th grandchild? I mean, for years, Joe Biden has been saying, I have only 6 grandchildren. He has said it repeatedly. And this is not a result of his dementia. At Christmas time, he ignored the daughter of Hunter and London Roberts while hanging stockings. He only put 6 up on the fireplace. Now, if you say, well, that's his personal business, let me tell you something. I think character matters. Now, when it comes to, Joe Biden, I'm not sure he has much character to begin with. He's an inveterate liar, plagiarist, cheat, criminal, heads up a criminal organization, the Biden crime family. So he doesn't have much character anyway. But when a man will not admit the existence of a child or a grandchild, not even admit that the child exists. And by the way, like father, like son, you might remember that when Hunter Biden fathered this child, this little girl who is now 4 years old, by all accounts, she's a wonderful little girl, but most 4-year-olds are wonderful anyway. When you won't admit that the child exists, and in Hunter's case, he actually fought the notion that that was his child. He denied that it was his child until he was finally forced to take a paternity test, and yep, that's right, Navy Joan is the daughter of Hunter Biden, the granddaughter of Joe Biden. What does it say about a man like Joe Biden, President of the United States, if you believe the 2020 election, which I don't, but that's a subject for another day. But what does it say about a person who will not admit the existence of his grandchild? I think it is pathetic. I think it is a showing of lack of character. But what do? They sent out a printed statement late on a Friday night saying that Joe Biden now admits. He says he wants what's best for Navy Joan Roberts. Our son Hunter and Navy's mother London are working together to foster a relationship that's in the best interest of their daughter. Well, I think that's open to debate as well. You might remember that London Roberts actually said she wanted to get child support from the father of this little girl. And Hunter Biden didn't want it. He fought it every step of the way. He actually showed up in an Arkansas courtroom and pleaded poverty. He said, I don't have enough money to pay this kind of child support. He arrived on a private jet owned by one of his friends, and one of his buddies just paid $2 million in back taxes that Hunter Biden owed. This whole family is about as sleazy as the day is long, but now Joe Biden has officially acknowledged his 7th grandchild, and I guess that kind of gets the matter out of the way. That means he can go back to ignoring her from this point forward. Anyway, welcome to First Amendment Friday. Glad to have you with me and glad to take your calls. I want to do something before I go to calls, but if you want to dive in, it's 866-HEY-LARS. And if you're a naysayer, you go right to the head of the line at 866-439-5277. That's a tradition we've had for more than 23 years. And that is, if you call my producers and say, Lars is full of it, he doesn't know what he's talking about, he's completely wrong, they say, oh, you're a naysayer. You go first at 866-439-5277. But let me ask you this first. Should we have an age limit for Congress and other elected offices? And if so, what should that age limit be? Let me give you a couple of examples. There is Dianne Feinstein, who is now 90 years of age, still holds office, and was sitting there in a hearing in the Congress, in the Senate, and a vote came up, where the senators have to vote aye or nay. And you're not going to hear all of it. It's a little difficult to hear. But one of her staff members literally had to urge her, just vote aye. Just vote aye. Take a listen to the sound.
Senator Feinstein.
Say aye. Pardon me? Aye.
Yeah.
Just say I would like to support a yes vote on this. It provides $823 billion. That's an increase of $26 billion for the Department of Defense. And it funds priorities submitted.
Yeah, just say aye.
Okay, just
Great.
aye.
Thank
Aye. Can you believe this? This woman is taking part in decisions about spending 0.8 trillion, and she thinks they're still talking the matter over, and a staff member several times had to say, just vote aye. Now, just so we can be bipartisan about all this, you've also got Mitch McConnell, and I want you to take a listen to this. This happened earlier this week. Now, as you know, he had quite a bad fall a few months ago, had a head injury, and then he fell again this week as he was deboarding from a plane. I want you to take a listen to what happened. He showed up at a press conference. He was the primary speaker at that point. He was in front of the microphones, and something went terribly wrong. Take a listen.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. We're on a path to finishing the NDA this week. There's been good bipartisan cooperation and a string of...
And that's when he ran out of gas. And then he went silent for a total of 19 seconds. 19 long seconds until one of his fellow senators stepped forward and kind of shuffled him off to Buffalo and got him off the stage. He actually just completely lost it. He was staring at the reporters. We don't know what happened. He says he's fine now, and he has also said he's going to finish out his term in the United States Senate. Do you think that makes any sense? Now, I know he's also a Republican. I wouldn't necessarily call him a conservative. I think he's acted in his own interest, but apparently the state of Kentucky likes him well enough. But do you think that people, when they get to the point where they can't even function, they don't know what's going on around them, they freeze up in the middle of a sentence, should they keep that job? Let's go to Jeremy on a First Amendment Friday. Hey, Jeremy, you called in about that young lady who's now been charged with a crime down in Alabama because she filed the false police report claiming she was trying to rescue a toddler and got abducted when, in fact, no such thing happened. What's your take on all that?
Yeah, First Amendment Friday. I love that. Well, I just think it's a slippery slope if you start putting everybody in jail for false police reports. There's too many cameras out there. There's too many people with smartphones. We're going to end up putting a lot of cops in jail because they end up filing false police reports all the time, and that's been proven with the camera phones.
Well, that's an interesting take on it. You think the police will be charged with filing false police reports. Jeremy, thanks for the call. It's First Amendment Friday. We'll talk about movies and pop culture coming up next. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. On Friday nights, we love to talk movies and pop culture with our friend Christian Toto, the host of the Hollywood and Toto podcast. How you doing, Christian?
I'm good.
Now, have you seen this Barbie movie?
I have. It's my duty as a citizen and as a film critic to absorb this movie. And I have to say, to be honest, I didn't like it generically, but I did think it started strong. I thought it had some good ideas, some good performances. I just think it really loses its way. But I am in the minority because this movie is getting very good reviews, and the box office is unbelievable. It is the hit of the summer, and not even remotely slowing down. So either the word of mouth is amazing, or people are just plumb curious to see it at this point.
You know, one of the contradictions in terms that I noted was that the movie is rated PG-13, right?
Yes.
But it's a movie aimed primarily Barbies or toys for little girls for the most part, between the ages of about, 4 and 12?
It's a good point. It's a fair point, and it is interesting because I think if you looked at the marketing, you would say, "Oh, this should be for all audiences." But listen, there's no nudity here. There's no graphic sex or violence. But it is a mature story in a lot of different ways. Partly it'll go over the kids' heads when they watch it, and partly maybe they'll be a little bit bored by all that lecturing. So yeah, I've been talking about it as a bit of a bait and switch here, especially with the marketing campaign, which did frame it in a much more touchy-feely way. But it's really very feminist in nature, and that could be fine. But I found it preachy and heavy-handed. And just my best example is that the word patriarchy is mentioned at least, I counted at least 10, and maybe I missed a couple, but that kind of tells you the direction of the movie.
Well, I hope that one of these days my now 7-year-old granddaughter will know the word patriarchy. I mean, she'll know what it means, but I don't think it's going to be a real common word for 4 through 12-year-olds. So why do you suppose they went so woke? And am I wrong? I haven't seen the movie, but is it? Am I wrong to assume that it's probably a very woke movie?
It is, and I wanted to define that a little bit because I think woke is a combination of there's definitely a progressive message in the movie. And in my opinion, that progressive message stalls the story. You can have a movie that's feminist in nature, that explores issues, imbalances between the genders. That's perfectly fine. And that's actually great in movies because you want movies to have more themes, more subtext. It makes it richer. But when I say it's woke because it's interrupting the flow, it's getting in the way. When you've got a screenplay that mentions patriarchy 10 times, that's a red flag. When you have a character give an out-and-out speech, almost like a TED Talk toward the middle end of the movie, that's a woke moment. So that's I think, I want to be careful when I use the word, because I think sometimes we throw that word around very loosely, but I think it does matter here. I think it is in effect here, but apparently people don't seem to care, or there's enough other things in the movie that they enjoy.
I'm talking to Christian Toto. He's the host of the Hollywood and Toto podcast. You can also read what he writes at Hollywood and Toto. And one of the things you wrote that I took note of, the film is so obviously anti-male, it's silly to argue otherwise. But Christian, I will tell you, I have to confess that I have some experience lately of playing with Barbies. Now, you might say, Lars, that's a freaky thing for a 64-year-old guy to do. I play with Barbies because my granddaughter wants me to. She has, the Barbie house and the Barbie this and the Barbie that and lots of Barbies. And so I'm glad to play and she makes up stories and all this stuff. Why would Barbie be anti-male if I didn't play with Barbies when I was a kid, but if I understand it, Barbie is this fashionista who dresses in nice clothes and is very much a girly girl and has a nice house and a car and a Jeep and, every other thing. She can have a plane. And she dreams of Ken, doesn't she? Why would Hollywood take that and say, no, this is anti-male? Why? Or how is it anti-male?
Well, that's not a question for me directly. That's a question for Greta Gerwig. She is the director.
Oh, I'd love to interview her
of the film. Oh, would I like to as well? Yeah, absolutely. Because she's a very talented person, by the way. She's a good actress and a good director. Yeah, it's a bit of a head scratcher why they'd go in that direction. To me, again, I'm a guy. I don't have my kids. I have 2 boys, so they didn't go through the Barbie phase. It felt like
Barbie you're G.I.
was,
Joe then, right?
That's right. But I feel like Barbie is aspirational. She's beautiful. She's got a career. She's got this. She's got the dream house with the car, all the stuff. And
all the stuff that feminists probably hate, right?
But what's interesting about the film, and to appreciate its anti-male nature, you really have to see it and have to see the last third of it. I think that's really important as well, because the Kens in the movie are basically considered second-class citizens, maybe third-class citizens. They're just mistreated. But you would think that part of maybe your granddaughter's experience is, boy, here's Barbie, here's Ken, and they're gonna go on a date. They're gonna get married and move into a house, that kind of a thing. And yet the film is so aggressively anti Ken and Barbie having a relationship. It's so interesting that they went in that direction, because Ken has a crush on Barbie, but Barbie wants nothing to do with Ken. Nothing. It's as if he's covered in snakes and spiders. That's how disgusted Barbie is.
Don't tell me that. Now I know this may be a spoiler alert, but as I said, I haven't seen the movie, and frankly, I have no interest in seeing it, other than maybe to warn my granddaughter away from it. At age 7, we try to protect what she sees, what she doesn't. But she wants nothing to do with Ken because what? She wants an androgynous or metrosexual male who lets her take the lead. Is that what it is?
She has no interest in seemingly in dating, or in Ken, or in men, or in anything beyond being a feminist superpower. Listen, you have to see the movie. My words don't do it justice. And again, you can do that. It is odd. The movie is crying out for a more just society. The movie is attacking the patriarchy, saying that the culture is dominated by men and it's unfair. And yet in Barbie Land, it's the opposite, where women rule. It's hard to describe without giving away too much, but
okay.
If everyone could go read Piers Morgan's column on the movie, it's really quite good. And he basically said if he had made a movie that treated men in the way this movie did, but with women, that he'd be executed or something similar. Yeah, exactly. So good for Piers. He had a very sober analysis of the film. And listen, this is a comedy. We can talk about it. I actually like movies that spark conversations, but given the push to get a better sense of equality in the country and for women to get full rights, which I'm all on board with, it is odd they went in this direction.
Well, let's take just a moment with Disney's new Haunted Mansion remake. Is that a hit or a miss?
Yeah, the reviews are pretty poor. I didn't like it myself that much. I think it's better for kids with low expectations. And also, if you're a kid and you want to watch a horror movie, but they're too scary, you're not ready for it yet, this has got some mild, spooky moments and some laughs in between. So it's almost like a horror movie starter kit for the youngsters who maybe will want to someday, watch the real thing. I think it works best there. It's a very good cast. Tiffany Haddish, Owen Wilson, Dana DeVito, good people here. But the story is just weak. And you know what? If you're going to aim a movie and it's going to be aimed at kids, don't make it 2 hours. Make it 90 minutes. In and out, you're done. These movies are way too long. And the story and the plots and all the different elements, it just does not warrant a 2-hour movie. That's my biggest critique. You got to make these movies shorter.
I will tell you this, Christian. A couple of years ago, when we hadn't yet rejected The House of Mouse. I mean, I'm really off of Disney right now, but we would take Payson to Disneyland about once a year, and we're about 800 miles away from the West Coast Disneyland, about 3,000 miles from Disney World. But one of the rides we worried about was the haunted house, because we thought, well, it might scare her too much because it can be a little spooky and it's in the dark and all that. She loved it. She said, let's get back in line and do it again. So, maybe the starter kit for younger kids, not such a bad idea. Christian, how's the podcast coming along?
It's going well. I had a great conversation this week with a filmmaker who predicted the woke revolution, and we didn't heed his warning. So you can check out that interview with it's Ted Balaker, a really smart guy. He did Can We Take a Joke? It was a great documentary from 2015.
Very good. Christian, it's a pleasure. Have a wonderful weekend.
Thanks, you too.
When we get back, we're going to take a bunch of phone calls. I want to see what you've got on your mind. That's what First Amendment Friday is all about. It's why about a quarter century ago, I said, look, we've got to have one day of the week that is set aside entirely for the point of view of people who are calling in. So everything is fair game. And of course, naysayers always go first at 866-HEY-LARS. And you're listening to The Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. I couldn't have been happier when I heard Kevin McCarthy admit, yes, it's possible we'll actually begin the impeachment of President Joe Biden. I've been waiting for this for a long, long time. You might have noticed that I ask a lot of members of Congress who come on the show. I'll say to them, okay, when do we start the impeachment of Joe? And usually they defer. They say, well, it's a complicated thing. No, it's not. Has he committed high crimes and misdemeanors in the Biden crime family? I think the answer to that is yes. Do you have the people willing to testify? Sounds like they do. And finally, Kevin McCarthy says, yeah, we're opening up the door to an impeachment inquiry. So they're kind of sticking their toe in the water. I thought I'd talk about it with Sarah Bedford, who is a political and investigative reporter for the Washington Examiner. Sarah, welcome back to the program. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
Well, tell me this. When they say, and when you've written at the Washington Examiner, that McCarthy, Monday night, it was last week, said there was enough evidence, I think it was last week, implicating Joe Biden in the foreign business dealings of his son, Hunter Biden, that has emerged to warrant consideration of an impeachment inquiry. You think?
Well, I think, to his credit, I think McCarthy has preserved his credibility a little bit here because he didn't start out day one talking about that being a possibility. He didn't even start to beat that drum when there was growing evidence of Joe Biden potentially being involved in his son's business dealings one way or another. He waited until, those sorts of revelations reached the type of tipping point where bringing up the impeachment inquiry is riding a wave of momentum, so to speak, of interest in this, and evidence that's harder and harder for Democrats to dispute. And the fact that on Monday you're going to have Devin Archer, one of Hunter Biden's close ex-business associates, coming into the House Oversight Committee and testifying to how deeply involved Joe Biden personally was in these business matters, I think that sort of gives McCarthy the vehicle to launch the impeachment inquiry if that's what he's interested in.
Well, and that's if that's what he's interested in. Sarah, I was a kid in high school when Watergate happened, but I remember the press's attitude was, "Hey, we've seen a little bit. We think there's more, and we're going to go out and beat the we're going to go out and look for this evidence." And they did that. And Nixon ended up resigning rather than being impeached. Today, the press seems to be, oh, Joe, yeah, we're not interested in looking at that very much. And they've shown their disinterest, really going back to the laptop from hell in October of 2020, which is coming up on 3 years ago. Are we going to see that? I mean, not at the Examiner, the paper you work for, but at a lot of press organizations, they just look at it and they seem to ignore it. Oh, Joe's son was making millions by selling influence, and Joe says he didn't know about it, so we just take his word for it. Is that really where we are with journalism today?
Right, a lack of curiosity. And I mean, just 4 years ago in 2019, we had an impeachment inquiry involving Donald Trump and conversations that he had with the president of Ukraine, somewhat ironically involving Hunter Biden's work in Ukraine, actually. But that was wall-to-wall coverage, and the impeachment inquiry moved very quickly after that phone call, and there was enormous interest in every little detail about the impeachment inquiry. So I do think, there will be apples-to-apples comparisons about the way the media covers this. But from House Republicans' perspective, the Justice Department has been pretty successful so far in dragging their feet and stonewalling a lot of these congressional inquiries. But the impeachment inquiry designation does give Congress more powers than it has right now. It gets more funding potentially to hire extra staff to pour through all these documents. It supersedes some of the excuses that the Justice Department and other federal agencies might have about ongoing criminal investigations or other agency interests. Congress can sort of cut through some of that red tape and speed this along. I mean, the investigation into Hunter Biden at the federal criminal law enforcement level started in 2018. It's been 5 years. So clearly there's an interest in dragging this out.
Well, and it just seems as though not just is the press uninterested, the Washington Examiner being accepted from that, but members of Congress seems that, well, it's politically risky, as you referenced in your story. Politically risky if Hunter Biden was making millions, in my mind, I go through a series of questions because I ask myself this. What was he making money for? Was he digging ditches or sweeping floors? No, he was promising to do favors. Well, how would he do that? Well, his dad was vice president. Oh, did dad know about it? Joe Biden flatly denied that he even discussed any business matters with his son at all. He did that during the campaign in 2020. Today, the White House will only say, well, he wasn't in business with his son. Well, if he wasn't, what was his son promising that was getting him millions of dollars from these corrupt folks in Ukraine, which was, by the way, exactly what Donald Trump was asking about of Ukraine, saying, we think there's corruption in your country, and it connects back to people in our country. And the Democrats went ballistic and said, you have to be impeached for even posing that possibility. Well, now it looks like it's a probability instead, doesn't it?
Well, there is definitely more and more evidence, that Joe Biden was directly involved, a lot more than he said on the campaign trail. And it's so noteworthy. And, a peer of mine, Philip Wegman, asked the White House press secretary yesterday to explain why that language had been changed from never discussed business to never was in business. And hopefully, the White House press secretary has continues to face questions on that. They can't answer the question because to do so would be to acknowledge that Joe Biden lied during the campaign trail when he said he never discussed it. That's very clearly not the case. There's evidence all throughout Hunter Biden's emails and WhatsApp messages. There's evidence from the one FBI interview that investigators were able to pull off with Rob Walker, another one of Hunter Biden's associates. And we're about to get the most damning testimony in the case so far on Monday from Devin Archer. So, the White House can't really talk about this because to add any context to Joe Biden's current form of his denial would be to acknowledge that he lied.
And the other piece of this, Sarah, you say we're going to get it. They're going to get it behind closed doors. And I really, frankly, don't understand why they're doing it behind closed doors. If they want the public to understand what Joe Biden might have done or not done, or to use a Watergate phrase, what did the president know and when did he stop knowing it? Why don't they do it out in front of God and everybody?
I think there are a few considerations there. I mean, the closed door transcribed interview allows staff to conduct it rather than members, and they get a lot more time to ask questions, right? So you have the really experienced congressional investigators who are way more deeply knowledgeable about the ins and outs of the case, who can ask these really probing, really specific questions of the witness that a lawmaker who gets, his or her 5 minutes on C-SPAN to ask questions of the witness can't necessarily get into. So you get better quality testimony that way. Yep. I would not be surprised if the committee voted to release it. That's what Ways and Means did. They just released the transcripts of the IRS whistleblowers. And so I wouldn't be surprised if we got a transcript of Devin Archer sometime next week.
No, and I think that's why Hunter Biden's lawyers were so anxious to make sure that amicus brief that was filed in Hunter Biden's case did not become public, to the point where apparently one of the lawyers called the judge's office and lied about, I think it was a young lady, it was who she was, and said, you got to seal that stuff up so the public doesn't see it. I think they realize the writing's on the wall. Sarah, we're going to keep following your stories at Washington Examiner, and we always appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me.
That is Sarah Bedford, who's a political and investigative reporter at the Washington Examiner. Always glad to take your calls at 866-HEY-LARS. Send emails to talk@LarsLarson.com. Vote in our Twitter poll at Lars Larson Show. And you're listening to The Lars Larson Show.
My son has not made money in terms of this thing about, what are you talking about, China.
We'll get to that in just a little bit later. Welcome to First Amendment Friday on the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I'm always glad to get your phone calls and emails. I want to play for you a snippet of sound that comes from a 911 call. And I'm going to make this allegation because the allegation is also made in a federal lawsuit. That 911 call led to the false arrest of a military veteran, a man who had achieved the rank of Sergeant Major. And yet he was arrested by the cops, and they now argue they were entitled to arrest him. They were entitled to believe he was more likely to be a criminal because he was a veteran. Turns out he committed no crime whatsoever. Take a listen to the 911 call.
911, what is the address of your emergency?
I got somebody out here in my backwood that's hurting his wife pretty bad, I guess. And his name is Robert Hanks.
I guess is what the caller said. And that's about all the cops had to go on. That 911 call did lead to the false arrest of a Northwest veteran by the name of Robert Hanks. But today, we know that that arrest was based on information that even a federal judge today agrees did not give the police reasonable suspicion to arrest Hanks. So you'd expect the sheriff's office to say, okay, we really didn't have reasonable suspicion. We certainly didn't have probable cause. We arrested him anyway. We put his face in the gravel, and we put handcuffs on him right in front of the wife that he was supposed to have been beating on, and the wife was not abused. And there was never a formal court allegation of domestic abuse against Robert Hanks. And he asked for the sheriff's office to set this right, and they refused. They said, no, we did everything right. In fact, they're still in federal court today arguing that the entire case ought to be thrown out. Only last Friday, a federal judge decided the case would not be thrown out. Now, I'm going to give you some details on this, but first, welcome to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you on a First Amendment Friday. If you want to join the best conversation in talk journalism, it's right here every weekday at 866-HEY-LARS. And on First Amendment Fridays, every subject is fair game. And if you're a naysayer, we'll put you right to the head of the line at 866-439-5277. You can send emails to talk@larslarson.com. I'm just a veteran supporter of the police. I mean, I've been supporting the police for a long time, but I've always told callers when they say, Lars, you always support the police. I say, yes, I do, unless they violate the law, violate their own department's procedure, or violate the U.S. Constitution. I think that day with Robert Hanks, they violated the constitutional rights of an American citizen. They made him face down in the gravel in his front driveway, handcuffs on, treated him like a criminal for no reason. They didn't have the information to make that arrest. Now, I made that case yesterday, and I got a lot of blowback from it, but I'm going to answer all of it. One of them came from an unsigned gentleman who wrote Lars and said, Lars, I've been a cop for 25 years, and I know that the way people are treated is usually a reflection of how they act. If the lack of investigation statements is true, then that's an issue. My guess is he saw the cops, came out asking why they were on his property. When they started asking questions, he got riled up. The cops, knowing he was a veteran, meaning a trained fighter, decided to detain him. Well, that emailer was wrong, and I'll read from the court docket on Friday and show that was absolutely untrue, and apparently the sheriff's department doesn't dispute it at all. Now, consider this as well. Second email from Zane. Lars, as a 14-year veteran of law enforcement, it's hard to hear stories like this, but I feel all the information is not being presented. I only know the facts that you and the attorney presented, so that's the basis of my opinion. When we get dispatched to domestic disturbances, we want to know all the available information about the situation and the people involved. One of the first questions I always ask is, what kind of history do we have with this address or the person or persons at it? I never heard you speak of that in Mr. Hanks' previous history. Well, actually, we did. I said, did they know anything more about Mr. Hanks that led them to believe he was a criminal, he was a domestic abuser, that he was dangerous? Well, the county today in court says we had good reason to believe he was dangerous because he was a veteran. We had more reason to believe he was a criminal because he was a veteran. And they actually made this crazy argument. And I'm trying to get the county to respond. I'm trying to get the sheriff's department to respond. I'd love to have one of the county commissioners answer, why are they defending these indefensible actions? They actually made the argument he is more likely to be a domestic abuser because he is happily married to his wife and has small children at home. I know that sounds crazy, but I didn't make up the argument. Clark County, Washington made up the argument. Now, what did we get from the court on Friday? Well, the judge said to the county's request that they throw out the entire case, throw out the entire civil rights case. The judge said Mr. Hanks was cooperative and did not take any action at the scene that posed a risk of flight or danger to the deputies. The deputies did not have any information that Mr. Hanks was armed when they arrested him. That's a pretty definitive statement, isn't it? And then the judge said this in the decision made, weighing these factors, a reasonable jury could find the totality of the circumstances indicate the deputies did not have reasonable suspicion to detain Mr. Hanks. And by the way, Was he detained or arrested? Interesting, because the county and federal court is now arguing they had a right to search his house because he was arrested. But they also argue that they didn't actually arrest him, they only detained him. And there is a legal difference between being detained and being arrested. The problem is the county is trying to simultaneously argue we didn't really arrest him when they did arrest him, so they can't be said guilty of false arrest, but they really did have the right to search his house because he was arrested. Now consider that, and consider this. Defendants, that's the county, argue that Mr. Hank's status as a veteran and a firearms owner supported their reasonable suspicion that a crime had been committed and the method in which they conducted their investigation. Hold on a second. You mean that America's veterans are automatically under suspicion that they may be criminals because they have a background as a veteran? I find that absolutely lunatic. And then the judge said the deputies employed clearly intrusive means of detaining Mr. Hanks. Why? He walked out in his driveway, saw the police there. He works at the jail. And he says to them, what's going on? What can I help you with? They admit, even the defendants, the deputies in the county say, no, he didn't resist arrest. He wasn't upset. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't screaming. He wasn't armed. He was in a T-shirt, shorts, and flip-flops and completely cooperated. And they put him on the ground in handcuffs with his face in the gravel anyway. And the bigger issue is this. The deputies, going to a call of domestic violence, pull up in front of the address. Do they rush inside to save the poor lady who's being beaten to death? No, they sat out there for 15 minutes and didn't seek any additional information. I think Clark County and the sheriff have a lot of explaining to do. Glad to be with you on a First Amendment Friday. Always glad to get your calls. And you're listening to The Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to The Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you on a First Amendment Friday. Always glad to get your phone calls and your emails. And you know, on First Amendment Fridays, you know, all subjects are fair game. And naysayers always go to the head of the list at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@larslarson.com. And I got to tell you something. It's a pleasure to be with you on a First Amendment Friday. It is my favorite day of the week. My week never really ends, but on Fridays, I love hearing the variety that we get by opening up every subject matter out there. Let's go first to Sean. Hey, Sean, welcome to the Lars Larson Show. What's on your mind?
Hi, Lars. I'm calling in about the controversy around Jason Aldean.
The song, just so that, Sean, just to get the rest of the folks listening, if they haven't heard about this, it's Jason Aldean wrote a song called Try That in a Small Town. And its basic theme was that when you saw riots and looting and arson and murders and assaults and everything else in America's big cities by activist groups, if you try that in a small towns stand up for their own. And he's gotten all kinds of heat for doing that song. And I would agree with you. There shouldn't be a controversy at all. It really speaks to just about everybody who's a law-abiding citizen in this country. But people accused him of being a rapist, racist, being a pro-lynching, and a lot of other things. So that's just to bring everybody up to speed on what we're talking about. What's your take?
Well, you could break it down even simpler and say that song is about self-defense. And if you look at what's been happening in the country with people who have stood up for themselves, like Kyle Rittenhouse, the couple that went out on the yards with guns when their gated community got broken into, and the guy who choked out somebody on the subway in defense of the passengers on there. The left, the tyrants, they don't want people standing up for themselves. That entire song is basically promoting the idea of standing up for yourself, and they cannot let that message resonate with the American people. I believe they used the idea of racism just to trigger a reaction to tarnish the image of that song so it does not, promote that idea the way it's intended to. I believe that possibly even the courthouse scene that they tied to the lynching was even put in the video by somebody who wanted to trigger that reaction, somebody on Aldean's production team who didn't like the job he was working on.
Maybe, but Sean, and what Sean's talking about is this video was filmed in front of a courthouse in Tennessee that over 100 years ago was the scene of a lynching. But that's not the only thing that courthouse is known for. And Sean, I would venture this, and you think of tell me if this makes sense. Would you guess that any building over 100 years old anywhere in America has something associated with it that is unsavory by today's standards?
Oh, I'm sure you could find something.
Yeah, you could find something and say, well, that's an evil place. I don't believe in that. What I do believe in is that he does have a great song, and I think people should enjoy it. And if you don't like it, it's probably because you don't believe in people standing up for themselves. Let me bring on one of my buddies, and that's Ari Hoffman. He does a great talk show that follows mine. I'm his warm act on our affiliate station, KVI in Seattle. Ari, welcome back to the program.
Thanks so much for having me, buddy.
Tell me about this. Has this drug addiction problem that is called homelessness, but it's really all about drug and alcohol addiction, no matter where you find it in America, and it's a massive problem in places like Los Angeles, tens of thousands of people living on the streets, not because housing's too high, too costly, but because of drug addiction and substance abuse. Has this thing become so bad that we're going to have to tolerate explosions and fires within hundreds of feet of the front door of one of the major hospitals in your city?
It's worse than people even know, Lars. You're talking about gang warfare, where a guy who was removed as being the leader of this encampment came back and, according to the police report, placed IEDs surrounding the drug use tents. These aren't tents for sleeping. That's a huge misnomer where people think, oh, these guys are just down on their luck and living in tents. These tents are used for criminal activity. And to get revenge on the people who deposed him as their leader, he laid out a whole bunch of IEDs, allegedly. And
improvised explosive devices. Yeah.
Exactly. They blew sky high. And then what happens is the debris is hitting a hospital. People couldn't get to the hospital. It's a miracle nobody was killed during this whole thing. And yet this apparently was over $80,000 and fentanyl trafficking.
Well, that amount of money, people will kill people for that amount of money. But when you say, I want you to go further, because this was a place where, as I understand it, the drug cartels were saying, you want to get high, come down here. We'll let you take the drugs at this place. They were operating the modern version of an opium den.
Exactly right. So they had multiple tents using tent. How many tents are there in this place that they're using in? And apparently there were 20 people inside the new using tent, and that's where the bombs were set up around. And he was trying to take out his former customers. He was trying to take out the people that deposed him. And according to the police report, this guy taught them to make bombs in his spare time. And yet this is a guy who has a history of arson. This is a guy who's got a history of criminal offenses. This is a guy who's known in the drug trade. He's got multiple partners, and it was a competing drug battle. And yet we keep treating this like it's a homeless problem.
And by the way, Ari also writes for the Post Millennial, does a great job there, along with Jonathan Cho and Andy No and other great journalists. So, and what does it say when they blow the place up on a Friday, a week ago, and by Monday, this drug use location is already being rebuilt a couple of hundred feet from what is it, Harborview? Or is it, Harborview Medical Center in the city of Seattle, where you do your show. They're already on top of rebuilding this thing faster than police or anybody else can respond.
It's even crazier than that, Lars. Our friend Jonathan Cho, who you and I both have on our show all the time, he went out there, and because the ground was all destroyed, they started rebuilding the encampment up in the trees. He compared it to an Ewok village from Star Wars, from Return of the Jedi. That's what he compared it to. They're living up in the trees. So the city of Seattle goes in there the other day and starts clearing the encampment, but how long is that going to last? And you think these guys haven't set up shop somewhere else? But let's remember, this is in Washington Department of Transportation property, so it's a state issue. And Jay Inslee is the one who just got a whole bunch of money so he could be dealing with these encampments. They're not dealing with them at all. And the problem's only getting worse. And this is alongside our interstates. Who's to say they can't blow up an overpass, blow up a bridge, blow up a hospital, blow up anything else? We got lucky this time. But how much worse could it be next time? Because they're not dealing with cartel activity. They're not dealing with gang activity. They're not dealing with drug activity.
You know, and it also sounds like, I hate to say it, but it sounds like the drug cartels and the drug addicts and these ne'er-do-wells are far more capable and competent at doing what they intend to do than the forces against them, the police, the courts, the prosecutors, the officials who are supposed to be in charge of running a civil society. are less capable than the amateur hour drug cartels who are running these drug use locations in a major American city. Ari, thanks very much. That's Ari Hoffman. You can also find him on our affiliate KVI and at the Post Millennial. It's First Amendment Friday. Back in a moment. Always glad to get your calls at 866 Hey Lars. And naysayers go first on the Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's First Amendment Friday. It's my pleasure to take your phone calls and your emails at 866 Hey Lars. I would imagine right now for almost anybody who runs a small business, especially a retail business or even a big retail business, one of your biggest concerns is that the politically correct crowd is going to come down on top of you and accuse you of the R word, racism. And when that happens, you know, your entire business could be lost. So you go out and you try and do defensive things to make sure that you're never accused that way. Well, that's what happened with Starbucks. And I thought we'd talk about it with Stefan Padfield, who's an associate with the Free Enterprise Project. Stefan, welcome to the program.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thanks for letting me chat with you.
I mean, this story about Starbucks and how they brought on a law firm, what they call a white shoe law firm in Washington, D.C., Eric Holder, who I never thought was a terribly honest individual anyway when he was attorney general and not since then. This is a guy whose firm charges as much as $2,300 an hour to do consulting work and tell big companies like, in this case, Starbucks, how to avoid getting accused of racism or repair past damage.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story, and we've been aware of it at the Free Enterprise Project for quite a while and have had conversations and engaged with corporations about specifically this issue of, are they getting advice from the right people and are they sure the advice they're getting is good? And basically, you have lawyers like Eric Holder and his firm saying everything's great and just push DEI and do these, you know, sort of racial discriminatory programs because it'll look great for you in these equity, audits. And what they're really doing is literally discriminating on the basis of race. And it seems like finally people are waking up to this is a problem, and maybe these boards of directors shouldn't just be blindly following this advice as if it's just the greatest thing to do.
So some of these companies are actually bringing on consultants like Holder who actually make the problem worse instead of better?
Right, exactly. So you can imagine, particularly after 2020, corporations did want to make sure, and I think for Starbucks it was even an earlier problem, right? They had that situation, a lot of your listeners probably will remember, where a manager kicked out a couple of black customers, and then that became quite a firestorm. So they do something that seems reasonable on the surface, very much so. They went to a well-known, reputable law firm, and they asked for advice. How do we manage this situation? How do we avoid the liability that potentially comes from these situations? But the advice they got really seems to have been bad, and that is basically focusing solely on discriminating on a racial basis in this anti-racist way, right, which we hear so much about, where you discriminate more to try to rectify past discrimination. It's completely Orwellian. But they basically recommended things like these audits, like devoting money on a racial basis. And I'm sure on some level it seemed like, hey, we're doing the right thing, but I don't think it would have taken much additional thought to realize, oh, wait a minute, we're still actually discriminating on the basis of race. And now that's starting to really get back to the public's attention, particularly after the Supreme Court opinion we just had on affirmative action.
Well, and in fact, that case you mentioned from 2018 where the Starbucks manager said to two men, they were black men, and said, "You get out of here, you're not buying our products, so therefore leave," is the way the circumstance went, as I recall. Wasn't it about a month ago that a jury just gave that young lady about $25 million of Starbucks money because she got fired for that?
Right, exactly. I mean, it is, I don't know if irony is the right word, but certainly I think a lot of people were concerned from the very beginning, right? Because if you sort of ask, I think, the common man on the street, and you say things like, hey, if you own a store and somebody's just sitting there and they're not buying anything, should you be able to ask them to leave? And the answer is sure. And if somebody makes a mistake as a manager, should you just fire them where you wouldn't fire them if they were black, but you're going to fire them because they're white because you're basically scapegoating them? I think that's probably, if I had to guess, what the jury, at least in part, was looking at. And so there's just layers and layers of problems. So, right, even that situation, which, you would think, well, at least they had a beginning that was justifiable, really was already problematic from the start, and they just seemingly have made things worse by doubling down on this racism again and again.
Well, Stefan, look, I'm a small employer. I employ 3 people. I'm actually short one right now. But I've told them, I said, I have a young lady working for me. I have a young man working for me. But if to fill that third position, if I said, we're going to go with DEI, I wouldn't go with diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm going to hire somebody who's capable of doing the job. I don't care what gender they are. I don't care who they like to sleep with or have sex with. I don't care what color their skin is. I care about their ability to do the job. But if I were to announce, I'm going to deliberately hire somebody who's black and female, the way Joe Biden did with his vice president, the way he did with a member of the Supreme Court, I think those are shameful occasions, but he got away with it. But if a company did that, how long is it going to be before some of the people who lost out on the jobs don't come back and say, you hired somebody less capable than me because of their skin color. You have discriminated against me. In some ways, Stephen, it surprised me that we haven't seen those cases already.
I think you're exactly right. And one of the things that I'm very proud of in terms of what we do at the Free Enterprise Project is there is an issue in terms of finding plaintiffs because people are concerned about backlash. They're concerned about becoming unemployable if they say the right things that are then cast as, again, being racist. Whereas we as shareholders, the suits that we bring, and we have this lawsuit against Starbucks around these issues that you're talking about, we're bringing the suit as shareholders and we're saying, look, you're breaking the law. Therefore, you're breaching your fiduciary duty and harming the corporation. And so that allows us to have standing in a way and be more aggressive, if you will, in holding the corporation accountable. And we don't have to deal with the issue of trying to find these plaintiffs. Although I will say, I think those plaintiffs that you're talking about, we're going to be seeing more and more of them as we go.
Well, and especially in, I would guess, the higher dollar, kind of jobs. So, I mean, if you're a nurse, my mom was a nurse. If you're a nurse and you go for a job, but you're aware that the hospital or the clinic you want to work for is doing DEI stuff all day long, and you say, but I've white skin, and they pass me over, I've got better scores, I've got more experience and all that, I can imagine that at some point one of those people is going to get angry enough. I understand the concern that they say, well, if I sue the hospital or go after the hospital for deliberate racial discrimination against me because of my skin color, maybe all of a sudden every other hospital is going to say, we don't want to hire you. But I would think some of the managers would say, we're doing wrong when we hire people not based on their skills and talents and abilities, but based on their skin color. There have to be some managers out there who don't like doing this, even though that's what the boss is telling them to do.
I think that's exactly right. I think you're hearing a lot of grumbling. People are willing to express those concerns behind closed doors, so to speak. And I think certainly there's a growing willingness to now speak up publicly. So I think we're only going to see more of those suits. And certainly these things are connected. So when we sue as a shareholder, part of our argument is, look, you are going to eventually face these suits from these employees, from these managers. And so that just increases your liability that you're exposing yourself to by pursuing these racist policies. So I think this is only going to get worse for the corporations before it gets better. But in the long run, that should be a good thing because we should be able to get rid of these racist policies.
Yeah, I think they're going to look back on it maybe the same way that Hollywood looked back on the blacklist in the 50s. Stefan, thanks very much. I appreciate what you do at the Free Enterprise Project.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely glad to do it. What if you could help turn back the clock and help your dog play like a puppy again, no matter their age? It's Lars, and it sure works for Sir Winston Churchill, my Bernese Mountain Dog. That's why Dr. Marty developed Nature's Blend, because your dog needs a diet full of real cuts of meat, similar to what they'd eat in the wild. Dogs go bonkers for Nature's Blend. When given the choice between Nature's Blend and the giant online retailer's #1 bestseller in dry dog food, a study shows 29 out of 30 dogs choose Nature's Blend first. Tori from Tulsa says, my fur baby is so eager to eat it. Other dog foods I've tried gave my sweet boy issues with allergies. They all went away with Dr. Marty's and Nature's Blend. Give your dog a food they'll love and help support their youthful energy, healthy skin, easy digestion, and a happy full life. For a limited time, claim 54% off Nature's Blend and get a free pack of premium dog treats from Dr. Marty Pets. Go to drmartypets.com/pets or text PETS to 511-511. That's text PETS to 511-511. Study available on request, message, and data rates apply. Back in a moment. It's First Amendment Friday. Glad to get your phone calls and emails at 866-HEY-LARS. And tell Alexa to play the Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I'm always glad to get you your phone calls and emails. I know there are things that a lot of us who do talk radio talk about, and then we get called liars, like the fact that we have said that the Internal Revenue Service, like too many federal agencies, has decided to have its own very well-armed SWAT teams, almost a military level of armament, I would say, for the Internal Revenue Service. And a lot of us, I've tried to ask just reasonable questions about this, like, why does the IRS need to have all these weapons, all this ammunition, all this combat gear? A lot of money, millions of dollars worth of guns and bullets and ballistic shields and all kinds of shotguns and body armor vests and all the rest. And I've had, people make the reasonable objection. They say, well, occasionally the IRS actually has to go out and seize control of property and take it for tax purposes. I said, I understand that, but they have access to the U.S. Marshals, to the FBI, to local law enforcement, including police and sheriffs. Why do they have to have their own armed units? And I've never heard a sensible explanation. Brandon Arnold is the executive vice president of the National Taxpayers Union, and I think Brandon's been asking the same kind of question. Brandon, welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
So tell my audience what you know about what the IRS has been doing to arm itself up, and is there any sensible justification for doing this?
Yeah, I think you really hit the nail on the head. The IRS does have a huge arsenal of weapons and ammunition, body armor, other types of assault weapons and gear. They've got semi-automatic shotguns. They've got assault-style rifles. This isn't just a sidearm. We're not just talking about a pistol that they may need to carry around with them in case things go south. We're talking about a pretty hefty arsenal of weaponry, thousands and thousands of weapons, and they've spent about $10 million on these weapons just over the past 3 years. So this is very, very concerning. And when we see some of the incidents that have taken place with IRS agents making house calls, sometimes very politically suspicious house calls, it just raises a lot of questions about this agency. It's been a rogue agency for as long as I've been monitoring them, which is decades. And, this is just another incident where we need to rein in the IRS. And I think, as you alluded to, I think we need to move some of these functions, particularly these armed functions, to other agencies that are better equipped to perform them.
I would think so, too. By the way, Brandon Arnold is with the National Taxpayers Union. I think the person you may have been referring to specifically when you said, personal visits to their homes was Matt Taibbi, who's kind of a liberal guy, but he's also a guy who, he's a journalist. And on the day he was testifying to Congress, the IRS made a personal visit to his home. And I got to tell you something. In my last 40 years, I've been audited 3 times. I think I know why it happened. It was a long time ago. And on 2 of those occasions, I owed them about $100 from my federal taxes. And on one occasion, I owed them less than $50, and they said, "Don't even bother. We don't even write up stuff less than $50." And so, but they never came to my house. They call you up. So how often is the IRS actually going out on some kind of physical raid on the home or business of a taxpayer? Can they even justify it that way?
Yeah, I mean, they do perform house calls on occasion. And I should note, I don't say a lot of nice things about the IRS, but the new commissioner, Danny Werfel, just said that they're going to end this practice, generally speaking. But those unannounced visits are pretty rare. Usually what you're going to get is a letter in the mail saying, we're going to come to your house to ask questions, or we're coming to your place of business. You have fair warning. You can get the documentation, the paperwork, the receipts, what have you, prepared for that visit, and then you have a conversation with an IRS auditor or agent or so forth. So this Taibbi visit was very out of the blue, that he had no advance warning, and as you said, it happened to be on the exact day he was in Congress testifying about the weaponization of government.
Yeah, and testifying in a way that didn't make the White House happy. And of course, the IRS is the executive branch of government, or the White House controls the executive branch of government, and the IRS is an executive branch agency. So it's hard not to see the connection there, that Taibbi is saying things that Joe Biden and his folks don't like, and all of a sudden one of his federal agencies shows up at his house. And the only thing about Werfel that I would question is this: when they came out and said, "Oh, we've been doing it this way for decades, but now we're going to end this long-standing practice." Is it accurate to say that the IRS has been doing home visits unannounced on a regular basis for decades?
They have been doing them. I wouldn't say they've been doing them on a regular basis. And usually, like I said, they are preceded by a letter or some form of notification. Not always. Sometimes they like the element of surprise for whatever reason. But I think that's a huge mistake because it can put both taxpayers and IRS agents in danger when you have these unannounced visits. It opens the door for things like fraud. There was a very suspicious visit that just took place in Ohio in the district of Jim Jordan, who happens to be the chairman of the Judiciary Committee in the House, where an IRS agent was acting very squirrely. We think it's an IRS agent, but it could have been a fraudster. It could have been somebody that bought a badge off of Amazon or something that makes them look like an IRS agent and gathering sensitive information from senior citizens or other people who may not know better when somebody comes knocking on their door and identifies themselves as a federal agent.
Well, hold on now, Brandon, are you telling me they can't determine yet whether it was because I would think if you said, hey, an IRS agent visited this person's home on such and such a day at such and such a time, wouldn't a single call to the IRS have settled that one? If law enforcement had called the IRS and say, hey, was the guy who showed up at this person's house on your payroll and was he scheduled to do a visit or not? Shouldn't that be something that you could resolve pretty quickly and figure out?
You'd think so. There's still outstanding questions. And, if you read the newspaper articles about this or the letters that Jordan has sent to the IRS, they put this gentleman's name in quotation marks because they're not entirely sure if he was really an IRS agent. They need to get to the bottom of it right away. It should be an easy process, but for whatever reason, that information has not fully come to light. Fortunately, like I said, the chairman of the Judiciary Committee has a lot of tools in his arsenal, and he should be able to get to the bottom of this because he is madder than you know what right now.
Well, the other thing about the IRS creating this army, having thousands of weapons, millions of rounds of ammunition, ballistic shields, and all that, one of the reasons police agencies and the military are good at what they do is they drill constantly, and they're usually actively doing what they do. I mean, if you train a cop and put him or her on the street, driving around in a car, they're regularly and routinely doing stops, arrests, taking people in custody, things like that. I guess I just wonder how often the IRS is doing this and how do they keep this army busy? They were talking at one point about hiring up to 2,000 people who, in the job listing, it said you have to be prepared to carry a weapon and use deadly force when necessary. 2,000 people. Are they really doing enough raids to justify that? And if not, how are they staying in practice?
Yeah, they shouldn't be. Obviously, we have these isolated incidents. The criminal division at the IRS is the agency that famously brought down Al Capone decades and decades ago. So you do see the situations on occasion where they need to be well trained. But it seems to me to be incredibly duplicative to have that level of training, that level of expertise that's necessary to carry out that type of mission housed within the IRS. The U.S. Marshals seems to be a better fit for it, or any other number of federal law enforcement agencies. When you do have those rare unicorn events that pop up, bring in another agency to assist with whatever enforcement action that needs to take place. Let's keep the IRS focused on what the IRS ought to be doing. And by the way, they're still not answering the phones. They're still not processing tax returns. We have millions of tax returns that are backlogged, and they want to buy bullets and guns and go play cops and robbers. It's ridiculous.
It is ridiculous. Brandon, thanks very much. That's Brandon Arnold, who's the Executive Vice President at the National Taxpayers Union. It's First Amendment Friday. Your phone calls and emails are welcome at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@LarsLarson.com and vote in our Twitter poll. You'll find the Twitter poll at Lars Larson Show and at LarsLarson.com. Glad to get your calls at 866-HEY-LARS. And naysayers go first on the Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you. Should we let scientists make human life without any mommy or daddy at all? Now, if you wonder, Lars, is that even possible? Well, you know that science is making a whole bunch of things possible. Some of them are good, Some of them are not so good. And let me describe to you what is the latest development. But first, welcome to the program. If you want to join the best conversation in talk journalism, it's right here every day at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. Naysayers go to the head of the line at 866-439-5277. You can send emails, easy to remember, talk@LarsLarson.com. And you can vote in our Twitter poll. We put up a brand new question out of the news of the day every single day, and we put it up two different places. If you don't mind Twitter, with Elon Musk and a brand new symbol to represent Twitter, it's a big X, and there have been some interesting comments on the X as opposed to the little Tweety bird. That you can find us at Lars Larson Show on Twitter and on our website at larslarson.com. So on this program, you regularly hear a gentleman by the name of Wesley Smith. I've always been impressed. I think we've probably had Wesley on for the better part of about 20 years. He writes about human exceptionalism for the Discovery Center. And what he usually deals with is issues of life and death for human beings. To some extent, we've talked animals as well, because there are efforts out there to try to make animals equivalent to humans in the courts. But the piece he wrote about scientists coming close at this point, close but not quite there yet, and thank God for that. They are close to creating human embryos from just stem cells. So, you know, you've heard about efforts in the past couple of years to try to give a child more than two parents. I know, sounds weird, but there it is. Children are made in the image of their parents, and you hear about surrogate pregnancies. You hear about test tube pregnancies. I'm sure somebody will be offended by that. But as Wesley writes, during the great embryonic stem cell debate in the early 2000s, I personally witnessed scientists blatantly mislead legislators about biotech issues like cloning, adult stem cells, and the biological nature of embryos in order to gain funding, federal funding, and or resist new regulations. It was an effective but disgraceful tactic that disrespected the democratic process about crucial issues of morality and public policy. He said, now with the creation of human synthetic embryos, that's the term of art they're using, that is embryo models or embryo replicas, which are constructed with stem cells. I hope we're not slipping back to the bad old days of that mendacity, but I worry. A recent story about the breakthrough in Science News contains an incomplete description about human embryology that impacts the ethical stakes about what is being done. What he's talking about is scientists figuring out how to make human life without any humans involved, other than through the stem cells. Amanda Clark, who's president of the International Society for Stem Cell Research, says we first need to understand that a human embryo is the product of fertilization of an egg and sperm. Pardon my frustrated digression, but that basic fact of biology was repeatedly denied during the stem cell debate by scientists who claim that embryos made in a petri dish were not really embryos at all. They were merely pre-embryos, according to the scientists, or just a collection of cells. Does that sound familiar from some of the right to life discussions that we've had over the last couple of years, especially since the decision by the U.S. Supreme Court on abortion and Roe v. Wade? Back to the story, he says, here's where it gets problematic. Embryo models, on the other hand, self-assemble from pluripotent stem cells, the ones that have the power to make almost any type of cell in the human body. Therefore, embryo models do not meet the clinical, medical, or scientific definition of an embryo because they don't originate from the product of fertilization. This is the person who is a stem cell scientist, developmental biologist, and a geneticist at UCLA. But that's false scientifically. Human embryos can also be constructed through cell nuclear transfer cloning, which involves no sperm, no fertilization at all. Such human cloning has already been done. Dolly the sheep, you might remember, the cloned sheep was every bit a sheep. Cloned human embryos are as human as those that come through fertilization. Now, why is all this important? I think Wesley's absolutely right. We've got scientists who want to gain the power to create human life without any human beings being directly involved. And then comes the question, do you start doing what they call fetal farming, which means live experimentation on human fetuses. But to be able to get to it, the scientists want to say, well, what we're experimenting on isn't really a human embryo because it didn't come from the normal, natural process. It's something we made in a lab. Therefore, we can do anything we want to it because we can do experiments. He said, would there be today if, say, scientists could gestate human beings from an artificial scientific process for the purpose of experimentation or, and here's where it gets really interesting, organ harvesting? As you know, in America, every single year, literally thousands of people die because they're waiting for an organ transplant. They're waiting for a kidney, they're waiting for a liver, they're waiting for a heart, or any of the other many parts that we're made up of. What if science could create an embryo and grow those organs without calling it a human? And could they then harvest it like you harvest steak from a cow or pork chops from a pig? He says these embryo models are probably not organisms, but the day of artificial manufacture of human beings from stem cells who could be gestated just like a naturally conceived embryo is getting very, very close. He points out that in mid-June of last month, about a month ago, a little over a month ago, there was a preprint study with a reasonable facsimile of a yolk sac and a placenta precursor, structures with an uncanny resemblance to those of embryos at 14 weeks of development. The process to achieve an embryo model is so close to resembling the real thing. According to the scientists involved, his team first worked out how to grow mouse embryos past this developmental stage in lab dishes. Think about the implications of that. You start making parts. In fact, Hollywood's already gone there in the movies with that movie years ago called The Island, in which they were growing full-blown human beings, except their purpose was to be a spare parts bank for people who had enough money to be able to pay for it. Again, it's going to be expensive at the very beginning. But the ethical implications are absolutely gigantic. Would you allow the scientists to say, create a real live human being, saying, but we're going to save lives. You'll be able to harvest all kinds of things from these, and they aren't really human beings? Or do you have to admit that they are human beings and that what you're talking about is Frankenstein-like experimentation, where you decide to make human beings, cut them apart, take their parts, and at that point, we're no better than the communist Chinese who actually harvest their organs from prisoners in prison camps. You're listening to The Lars Larson Show.